Mara Whitlock had learned long ago that winter could strip away more than leaves from the trees. It stole certainty, kindness, and sometimes even the courage to hope. Snow had buried the valley of Ashen Creek for 3 relentless days, and every roof groaned beneath the weight of ice. The narrow streets had emptied as families locked themselves indoors, guarding the little food they had left. At the edge of town stood Edwin Crowther's flour mill, its weathered walls creaking with every blast of frozen wind. Since her husband Daniel had died the previous spring in a quarry accident, Mara had survived by accepting every task the mill offered. She swept sawdust from the floors before sunrise, stitched torn grain sacks by lantern light, scrubbed storage rooms until her hands cracked from cold water, and counted inventory late into the night. Payment rarely came as coins. Most days it was a bowl of thin stew, a crust of stale bread, or permission for her and her 8-year-old daughter Elsie to sleep behind a wooden partition inside the mill. It was not a home, but it kept the wind away, and that was enough. As the blizzard gathered outside, everyone believed the arrangement would last until spring. Mara believed it too, right until Edwin summoned her into the storage room on the coldest morning the valley had seen in years. Flour sacks towered behind him while the village preacher and 2 foremen stood silently nearby. Edwin folded his thick arms and spoke without looking directly at her. Supplies were disappearing faster than expected. The roads were buried beneath snow. No wagons would reach Ashen Creek for weeks. Every extra mouth threatened everyone else. His voice remained calm, almost bored, as though discussing spoiled grain instead of a family's life. "There's no longer room for you here." For a moment the words seemed unreal. Mara glanced toward Elsie, who stood quietly near the doorway holding a small stoneware jar with both hands. The child did not cry or ask questions. She simply looked at her mother with frightened eyes that searched for reassurance. Around them, workers lowered their heads. No one objected. No one reminded Edwin how many nights Mara had worked while others slept. No one mentioned that she had repaired leaking roofs, rescued damaged grain after storms, or warned repeatedly that moisture had begun seeping through the northern rafters. Her warnings had been dismissed every time. Edwin had laughed and insisted the roof would survive another season. Mara understood then that hard work earned usefulness, not loyalty. She nodded once, refusing to beg. Pride was one possession winter could not steal unless she surrendered it herself. She packed everything they owned into a faded flour sack, 2 blankets, a small cooking pot, several dried potatoes, a worn knife, and Daniel's folded geological survey map. Elsie tucked the stoneware jar carefully inside her coat before changing her mind and holding it against her chest instead. She guarded it more carefully than any toy. Outside, Juniper the old mule waited patiently beside the loading dock while Bramble, the shaggy sheepdog that had followed Mara ever since Daniel's funeral, circled protectively through the falling snow. Edwin tossed Mara one final sack containing a handful of spoiled flour and several potatoes that had begun to soften. "It's more than I owe you," he muttered before turning his back. Mara lifted the sack without answering. She noticed the flour already clumping from dampness. Even now, the roof leaked. She looked once toward the warped northern corner of the mill where thick icicles hung beneath broken shingles exactly where she had warned repairs were needed months earlier. Then she led Elsie away without another word. Villagers watched from frosted windows as the widow, her child, the mule, and the old dog disappeared into the white wilderness. No voices called after them. No doors opened. Their silence stung more deeply than Edwin's cruelty. After they left the last house behind, Elsie finally spoke. "Do we still have a home?" Mara swallowed before answering. "Not yet." It was the only promise she could honestly make. The narrow mountain trail climbed steadily away from Ashen Creek. Snow buried familiar landmarks until every direction looked the same. Juniper struggled across hidden ice while Bramble raced ahead, disappearing behind drifts before returning to check on them. The wind erased their footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. Mara kept walking because stopping meant freezing. Inside her coat rested Daniel's old survey map, softened by years of folding and unfolding. She remembered evenings when he had spread it across their kitchen table, tracing forgotten mining routes with rough fingertips. One faded pencil note had always puzzled him. Near a place marked Black Furnace Ravine, someone had scribbled only a few words: "Ground remains warmer than surrounding terrain. Possible geothermal influence." At the time it had seemed like meaningless information. No settlement existed there. No road passed nearby. After Daniel died, the map became nothing more than a memory she could never throw away. But now, with every safe place behind them disappearing beneath snow, those forgotten words became their only destination. Hours passed beneath darkening skies. Elsie stumbled again and again until Mara finally lifted her onto Juniper's back despite the mule's heavy load. The child's cheeks burned red from cold while her fingers turned frighteningly pale whenever she loosened her grip on the stoneware jar. Mara wrapped another blanket around her daughter and continued climbing. Bramble suddenly stopped barking. His ears lifted toward the ridge ahead before he darted away from the trail entirely. "Bramble!" Mara called, but the dog ignored her. He raced toward a rocky hillside where the snow looked strangely uneven. Concerned that he had caught the scent of wolves, Mara hurried after him. She expected danger. Instead she found something impossible. The snow covering the rocks was thinner than anywhere else on the mountain. Dark stone pushed through the white surface in long narrow strips. Wisps of mist drifted upward from tiny cracks in the earth. Mara knelt and brushed away the remaining snow with trembling hands. The ground beneath was damp instead of frozen. Warmth touched her fingertips so gently she wondered whether exhaustion had begun creating illusions. Bramble barked excitedly and scratched near a cluster of stones where a faint current of warm air escaped from below. Mara stared in disbelief as Daniel's forgotten note echoed inside her mind. She slowly unfolded the weathered map with frozen hands, compared the surrounding cliffs to the faded markings, and realized they had reached Black Furnace Ravine just as the blizzard roared louder behind them. The shelter they desperately needed was somewhere close, hidden beneath the mountain itself, and finding it before darkness fell had become their only chance of surviving the night. Mara pressed both hands against the rocks where Bramble had been digging. The warmth was real. It was faint, but after hours of fighting the blizzard it felt almost unbelievable. She cleared away more snow until a narrow opening appeared between two large boulders. Warm air drifted steadily through the crack, carrying with it a scent she never expected to smell in the middle of a frozen mountain. It was the smell of smoke, and something else. Fresh bread. She froze for a heartbeat, convinced her exhausted mind had begun inventing impossible comforts. Elsie lifted her head from Juniper's back and whispered, "Mama, do you smell that?" Mara nodded without taking her eyes off the opening. She tied Juniper's rope securely to a nearby rock, wrapped another blanket around Elsie, then squeezed sideways into the narrow passage while Bramble eagerly disappeared ahead. The opening widened after only a few yards, revealing a hidden stone chamber unlike anything Mara had imagined. Steam drifted gently from cracks in the earth, keeping the entire cave warm despite the blizzard raging outside. An ancient brick oven stood against one wall, its fire reduced to glowing coals that still held enough heat to bake. Nearby rested shelves carved into the rock. Most had collapsed with age, but a few remained standing, holding clay jars, dried herbs, sacks of grain hardened by time, and bundles of firewood protected from moisture. Someone had once lived there, perhaps years ago, perhaps decades, but whoever they were had understood the mountain's hidden warmth. Mara quickly carried Elsie inside before returning for Juniper. Together with Bramble's help, she guided the exhausted mule through the widened entrance. As soon as the animal entered the chamber, it lowered its head with a tired sigh, finally free from the cutting wind. Mara searched every corner carefully. There were no footprints, no fresh ashes beyond the fading coals, no signs that anyone still occupied the shelter. The place had simply been forgotten. She knelt before the old oven and carefully stirred the remaining embers with a piece of iron lying nearby. Beneath the gray ash, glowing red fire awakened. She added dry wood from the stack until flames slowly returned. Warmth spread through the chamber almost immediately. Elsie's shivering eased. Color returned to her cheeks. Tears filled Mara's eyes for the first time since leaving the mill. She had promised her daughter only one thing, that they did not yet have a home. Perhaps now they did. While exploring the shelves, Mara found several tightly sealed grain barrels that had remained dry because of the cave's natural heat. Much of the grain had spoiled, but one barrel still held clean flour beneath its hardened top layer. She broke through the crust and smiled with relief. The stoneware jar Elsie had protected throughout the journey suddenly made sense. Inside it was the sourdough starter Mara had carefully kept alive since Daniel was alive, feeding it with tiny scraps of flour whenever she could. It was the last piece of their old kitchen that still survived. Even when they had almost nothing, she refused to throw it away. Elsie had carried it because she knew how precious it was. Mara mixed warm spring water flowing through a narrow crack with the usable flour, added the starter, and patiently kneaded the dough on a smooth stone table. The familiar rhythm calmed her racing heart. Hours later, the first loaf slid into the ancient oven. Soon the cave filled with the rich aroma of fresh bread. Elsie laughed softly as Bramble sat beside the oven, sniffing the air with hopeful eyes. It was the first laugh Mara had heard since Daniel's funeral. They shared the warm loaf while snow hammered the mountain outside, each bite reminding them that survival sometimes arrived disguised as forgotten miracles. Meanwhile, back in Ashen Creek, Edwin Crowther's confidence collapsed faster than the storm itself. The northern roof Mara had warned him about finally gave way beneath the crushing weight of snow. Meltwater poured into the grain storage rooms, soaking nearly every remaining sack of flour. Heavy beams cracked, trapping several workers beneath fallen timber. Panic spread through the mill as families realized their food supply had been destroyed in a single afternoon. Only then did Edwin remember the widow whose warnings he had ignored. Search parties were quickly organized despite the dangerous weather. Most believed they would recover only frozen bodies somewhere along the mountain trail. No one imagined that the woman they had abandoned had already found the one place capable of saving them all. Morning arrived without sunlight, yet the storm had begun to weaken. Deep inside the hidden shelter, Mara was slicing the second loaf of warm bread when Bramble suddenly lifted his head and barked toward the entrance. A moment later, faint voices echoed through the narrow passage. Men were calling her name. Mara grabbed a lantern and carefully stepped outside. The search party stopped in disbelief. Instead of finding a frozen widow buried beneath snow, they saw Mara standing alive, her cheeks touched by warmth, while the smell of freshly baked bread drifted from the cave behind her. Edwin Crowther pushed through the group, his heavy coat covered with ice. His face no longer carried the confidence of the man who had forced her into the storm. He looked exhausted and ashamed. Before he could speak, several workers hurried past him, drawn by the warmth escaping from the shelter. Mara silently moved aside, allowing the weakest among them to enter first. Inside, the injured workers stretched trembling hands toward the fire while Elsie handed each person a piece of fresh bread without hesitation. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the crackling fire and quiet tears from people who had expected only death on the mountain. Edwin finally lowered his head. He admitted that the mill roof had collapsed exactly where Mara had warned him months before. Nearly all the stored flour had been destroyed, and several families now faced hunger. Looking around the shelter, he realized the woman he had cast away had become the reason they were still alive. He quietly apologized, but Mara did not answer with anger. She simply said, "A warm fire saves more lives than a cold argument." Her words filled the cave with silence. Together they carried more grain from abandoned storage huts after the storm cleared, repaired the old oven, and turned the hidden shelter into a place where anyone in need could find warmth and food. Mara taught the villagers how to care for the sourdough starter, and every morning fresh bread came out of the ancient oven. Travelers crossing the mountains soon heard stories about the cave where no one was turned away hungry. Years later, people no longer remembered the blizzard only as the winter that nearly destroyed Ashen Creek. They remembered it as the season a widow everyone had abandoned chose compassion instead of revenge. Whenever the smell of fresh bread drifted across the valley, it reminded them that true strength is measured not by the power to survive alone, but by the courage to help those who once failed you. And from that winter forward, no traveler, no orphan, and no struggling family ever left Mara Whitlock's shelter without a warm meal, a safe place to rest, and the hope to begin again. The place hidden beneath Black Furnace Ravine became known simply as the Warm Hearth, proving that even in the coldest storm, kindness can become the fire that keeps an entire community alive.